First, I'd like to thank QED and our moderator for the opportunity to speak today and for putting together such a comprehensive program on European financial regulatory reform. I hope that you don't all think that I'm here to represent the American perspective, though I suppose I may bring that to bear here and there. Rather, what I'd like to do is provide a view from the standpoint of financial market intermediaries, which very much sit at the center of all of these changes. For those of you who are not familiar with DTCC, we operate clearinghouses that clear cash equity securities and fixed income securities in the U.S. market, as well as the Central Securities Depository for the United States. We also operate trade repositories around the world, including the largest trade repository in Europe, one in the United States, in Japan, in Canada, in Australia, and Singapore. So when I think, so we are very, very heavily regulated by the CFTC, by the SEC, by the New York Fed, by the New York State Department of Financial Services, by ESMA, by JFSA in Japan, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Ontario Securities Commission. I think you get the idea. So when I think about financial regulatory reform and how far we've come, I think about the enormous task that has been faced already in enhancing cooperation and increasing coordination across these various jurisdictions. And that increased coordination and cooperation, of course, is crucial because of the overarching goal of identifying, reducing, and properly managing systemic risks. Our largest systemic risks, of course, come from our largest global organizations and their connections to each other and to the financial market infrastructures that serve the industry. I think so far that we've made a very good start. While the work is ongoing, it's important that those in positions of authority and influence see their work not in terms of static objectives to be met and considered closed once finalized, but rather as part of a continuous and interconnected cycle. One of legislation and regulation, which in this post-crisis world has demanded heightened regulatory cooperation and active engagement with industry and with academic experts, which I think largely we have seen happening. New structures have been created, and the roles of existing organizations have been greatly expanded to address critical areas of risk that spread across institutions. Change, however, has its consequences, both those that are predictable and those that are not predicted, perhaps unintended, and perhaps unwanted. It's therefore critical that public authorities and regulators view and review their decisions in the context of this continuous cycle, as indeed the EU has demonstrated that it is done and it is doing now. As an aside, I suppose I will note that the European institutions seem to be much better about this process than the American ones. That ability to take a step back, assess and evaluate, and be willing to engage in recalibration or tweaking here and there, and then continuing with the process. I wish we could see similar changes in the United States. I'm not sure exactly why we have those differences, though I have some pet theories. At any rate, that process of stepping back and reevaluating and examining where the rules have succeeded and where they have failed is a critical part of the process. That ensures that predictable consequences, such as the risk for reform to be a drag on growth, can be fully evaluated, assessed, and decisions can be made whether changes are warranted. It also allows the opportunity for unintended negative consequences to be identified and assessed and addressed as well, so that they do not undermine either the goals or the efficacy of the overall financial reform effort. So there are two key areas of great interest to DTCC that I'd like to mention because they're also high on the European agenda as well. And these are areas where there is risk in the financial reform process if we do not adhere to a careful and balanced approach. First is the topic of CCP resources, which has been much talked about lately. Second is the continuing effort to ensure that regulators have access to timely and accurate data in forms that are useful for genuine evaluation. There we go. On the topic of CCP resources, policymakers at the moment are working together cooperatively, and they are very appropriately taking a cautious approach that begins with fact gathering and analysis rather than a rush to respond to sound bites in the industry. DTCC is an industry-owned and governed organization, and we very much agree that sound risk management benefits from aligned governance that ensures that those clearing members whose capital is at risk and whose business is transacted through our clearinghouses will understand our risk management procedures and have insight and input into the processes. Good risk management also benefits from robust regulatory oversight, which does not mean a prescriptive set of thresholds, limits, or specific default management rules. Instead, robust regulatory oversight should mean active engagement and true understanding between regulators and the supervised CCPs as to their default management structures. We should not race to prescribe a raft of new and specific requirements to which all CCPs must adhere. CCPs are not banks, and the product sets and the markets that they clear make meaningful comparisons across CCPs rather difficult. One size does not fit all in this area. Policymakers considering these issues should also bear in mind the knowledge and authority of the CCP's primary regulators, their ability to be close to the structures and understand the problems that are being solved, so that they can ensure that new rules preserve the flexibility of CCPs and their primary regulators to adopt new models over time and respond to new risks as market structures evolve. The dangers of unintended consequences loom large in this area. I'll also note that the foregoing concerns apply equally in the recovery and resolution context, where work is ongoing and we are expecting to see papers from the European Union very soon. While CCPs should each have credible resolution and recovery plans that are well understood and accepted by their regulators and their memberships, mandating the use of specific approaches or tools across all CCPs and across all jurisdictions could impair rather than enhance the value of CCP plans. On a very different front, data and security, data and transparency. Right? DTCC has long been a vocal proponent of coordinated international standards for data reporting formats. The creation of trade data repositories globally was a major component of financial services reform in nearly every jurisdiction. And we've done well so far, but it has not yet achieved its ultimate goal of providing regulators with accurate data that may readily be compared, aggregated, and effectively used to evaluate risks on a macroprudential basis. In the past year, we've begun to see progress in addressing some of the cross-border data sharing and trade repository recognition issues that have hindered the effectiveness of repositories in the first few years of derivatives reporting. We encourage regulators to continue this push to enhance data sharing and cooperation and to further unify the data sets being collected globally and to adopt universal identifiers for legal entities, products, and trades that will greatly enhance this process. I don't mean to ignore the equivalence issue either, which is, of course, of great interest in this cross-border world, but I expect that will come up in the question session. So just in conclusion, I'd like to note, Mr. Wilson said earlier that the approach of the Europeans right now in assessing the impacts to date of financial services regulatory reform was refreshingly pragmatic, is what he said. And I very much agree with and appreciate that view. I wish we could export a little bit across the Atlantic and see if we can have the U.S. authorities take up the same view. I think that won't quite happen just yet. I'll have to settle for watching developments as they occur in Europe and seeing how they may apply, and U.S. policymakers may take note of them in the future. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing more about European views on the ground during the Q&A session.